Hey everybody, welcome to episode 89 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. You can connect with the show by following us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or by visiting us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the nexus of social media and politics in Norway, which for many listeners may seem like a far-off country, but at least here in Sweden, it's right next door. And my guest is Dr. Bente Kalsnes. She is an associate professor in communication at the Kalsnes University College in Oslo, and she has done some really seminal work on how Norwegian politicians use social media to campaign, particularly around the 2013 Norwegian national elections. Now, fast forward to today, we have local elections in Norway being slated for August 9th, and we're going to dig into that a bit and the sort of history of Norwegian politicians' adoption of social media, and even before Facebook, look at some startup social media companies in Norway that local politicians in Norway were very tied to, but then ended up switching to Facebook and Twitter, and we'll get into the reasons for why that is. But at the beginning of the interview, we're going to talk about Dr. Kalsnes' new book, Falske Nyheter, which in Norwegian is fake news, and I'll spare you my Norwegian pronunciation of the subtitle, which translates into lies, disinformation, and propaganda in the digital public sphere. So the book disentangles some of the conceptual issues between terms like fake news and disinformation, and we'll get into that a bit. But what I was really curious to hear about is the Norwegian context, where we don't particularly think of Norway having a disinformation problem. It doesn't really seem to, but at the same time, it does share a border with Russia. And we'll talk about how the Russians seem to be targeting Sweden and Finland more than Norway, and Dr. Kalsnes will offer some reasons for why she thinks that is. But we'll also talk about Norwegian politicians' use of the term fake news, which is something that we've seen also in contexts such as the Philippines or Brazil, after Donald Trump has popularized the term. And listeners familiar with the Norwegian context might think that the use of fake news by Norwegian politicians comes from the Norwegian Progress Party, which is kind of one of the first classical, quote-unquote, populist far-right parties, but the answer for who's using the term fake news might surprise you. So apart from that, the last thing I'll preface this interview by saying is that Norway for me is kind of like this unexplored territory. I've been to the capital a few times, which is not very big, but it's romanticized as this wilderness, and people live in towns and villages and wear these traditional clothes and all this stuff. And I was wondering whether that geographic distance between people, because it's actually a huge country, does that have a implication for how politicians campaign or how citizens stay connected? Is social media somehow more prominent in Norway because citizens are digitally enabled? And what it turns out is that in Norway, because those towns are sort of localized, there's a very strong local community focus. There's a very strong local press in each town, village, whatever we want to call them. And that's even led some local politicians to abandon the idea of a Facebook page entirely and just operate within a friend network, which I think is super interesting and fascinating. And we'll get into all of that. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Bente Kalsnes. She is an associate professor in communication at the Kalsnes University College in Oslo. Dr. Kalsnes, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
So why don't we start out and talking about your new book, Fake News, or Falske Nyheter in Norwegian. And the book sets out to examine three questions. One is the difference between disinformation and fake news, why people share this content, and then how it can be fought. And I think what's interesting is all these questions are aimed towards technology and their effects on the digital public sphere. So I wanted to ask, can you describe your motivations for writing the book and why you place the digital aspect at the forefront of the discussion?
Yeah, part of the reasoning why I wanted to write this book was that I did my PhD dissertation about the political use of social media. I was writing about the Norwegian election campaign in 2013, and I was doing interviews with politicians and journalists and doing a survey with citizens on how they use social media in the election campaign. And back then, this was not a big problem, but some of the things we've seen later, we could also see that back in 2013. So in 2012, 2013, 14, the role of technology in politics was fairly positive. And a lot of Norwegian politicians was inspired by Obama when it comes to the way of doing campaigns, the way of using data, doing more data-focused campaigns. And they was very aware of the ability to bypass journalists and talk directly to the citizens and to frame the stories in their own way. So my motivation for writing this book was all the things happening in 2015, 2016, and particularly in the American election campaign, and how Donald Trump put this term on the agenda, literally.
It's interesting that we'll get back to the Norwegians and their campaigning in the 2013 election, but it's interesting that this positive aspect of social media kind of was borrowed from Obama, and then the negative aspect was also borrowed from Trump and Cambridge Analytica, which was mostly focused on the US.
Yeah, but I think in general, from like the mid-90s and until like early 2014, 15, it was more or less positive. There's lots of opportunities when it comes to technology and politics. It can increase participation, mobilization, it can make society more democratic. Of course, there were concerns, particularly when it comes to privacy, and that was also very clear in the Obama campaigns when it comes to micro-targeting. But I think the whole negative aspects of technology in politics has increased tremendously since then.
Yes, definitely. And I had this question later, but I'd like to ask it now, which is about the Norwegian context, which has a pretty high internet penetration, right? A lot of Norwegians are online, but they live it's a sort of very sparsely populated country, right? As I understand it, Norwegians live in more or less kind of towns or villages rather than cities. And so I'm wondering how social media played into that. Do you think that had an effect in terms of how politicians were looking at, let's say, connecting better with citizens because perhaps it's hard to get to them physically? No, actually not, because politics in Norway is very decentralized. You have lots of local party groups. So I would say politicians have close contact to citizens through the local community and not at least the local newspaper, because we also have very strong local newspaper tradition in Norway. But of course, social media is important in the sense to connect politicians and citizens. It's possible to have ongoing conversation. So of course, geography plays a role. But to get a really kind of dialogue between politicians and citizens, I think it's important also to have the physical meetings. Because that's also something we've seen in research, that it's really hard to create dialogue between politicians and citizens on social media. And in Norway, there's a strong local element for these parties, so they can kind of do that at the dispersed level. Yeah. Interesting. So going back to fake news, you have a lot of background as a journalist before you're an academic, and I want to pick apart that as we go along. But first, why do you think fake news has become such on the agenda recently? I mean, obviously Donald Trump's been using the term, but I mean, looking at online technologies and like the spread of rumors, for example, why do you think fake news has become such an issue within the past couple of years? Because it's become so easy to create a website, to fake a website, and to spread fake information that looks like news. We've had websites since the early 90s, so in that sense, it's been possible to do that for a long time. But we've seen that some people have decided to make website that looks like BBC or that looks like the Denver Post, and then they post something that is completely false, and people believe it. And we saw that in the American election, and of course we've seen it before. But there's been a clear increase, and we've also seen that it's possible to earn money on it through Google ads, and it's easy to spread it to large amounts of people through social media, particularly Facebook. Yeah. So it's the technology has become not just for a few, but it's so easy to do these days. Yeah. with a bit of YouTube tutorial watching and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what about the fake news and disinformation situation in Norway? Because Norway is kind of seen as this country that doesn't have many problems, but it does share a border with Russia in the north. So have there been any notable instances of fake news spreading in Norway, particularly from the Russians, for example, or any other types?
Okay, so if we start with the term, because fake news is used kind of like an umbrella term to describe different kind of problematic information. And one way to understand fake news is that it's completely made up. It's on a website that looks like a news site. It looks like news, but it's made up. So that can be one way of understanding that phenomenon. We don't see many of those cases in Norway, but what we see is when people are replying in surveys, when they are asked where do they see fake news, is typical social media, in particular Facebook. So that could be from Facebook pages or groups or made-up websites spread internationally. Of course, we do have some viral sites in Norway that is spreading problematic news or false or manipulated news. But in general, because Norwegians are also using the internet and social media, we are also getting that kind of story spread. When it comes to more propaganda or disinformation kind of stories, I think the situation is worse when it comes to Sweden and Finland. I think we've seen more cases of influence attempts in our neighbor countries. But of course, this is something we have to be very aware of. And this year we have an election, we have a local election, and there's lots of effort in order to protect the election and to avoid lots of false stories spreading.
Why do you think it is that Norway doesn't have as much of these propaganda invasions, so to say, compared to Sweden or Finland? Because I would think that, Norway has a strong public service broadcaster, and it has a certain media system that doesn't have a very partisan press, but neither does Finland or Sweden. So those are kind of similar countries in their media system. So what do you think it is about Norway that makes them less a target for these disinformation attacks?
Yeah, so it could be several reasons. It could be related to history. Finland as the closest neighbor to Russia. And Norway compared to Sweden, we're a member of the NATO. Sweden is not a NATO member, but they've been discussing NATO membership, and there's been lots of Russian attempts to influence that discussion. Norway is not an EU member, so I think it has a lot to do with the political situation and historical situation and what kind of international agreements we have. But at the same time, there's been some attempts, and it's also been public stories about this journalism based on how Russians tried to influence the Nobel Committee in, I think that was 2017. So we've seen stories like that in Norway as well.
Interesting. So I saw there's a section in your book entitled How Norwegian Politicians Have Used the Term Fake News. And we've heard a lot about that, in cases like the Philippines and Brazil, where politicians tend to emulate Donald Trump, who's popularized the term. So I'm curious to hear what's the situation. Have Norwegian politicians been picking up on that trend?
Yeah, because I was looking at how has Norwegian media covered the term fake news, and in what sense has politicians used it. And often they've been using it as a term to say that something is wrong. What you're saying is fake news, or what you're saying is it doesn't make sense, or something like that. Or they could use it to accuse a political opponent for producing fake arguments or fake facts. Or they could accuse the local media for producing fake news if they don't agree with the framing or the content. We've also seen some stories about politicians who say they have been victims of fake news. There's been campaign against them. But in general, politicians have been fairly careful with the term, in the sense that there's even been politicians who have warned other politicians not to use the term to criticize media because they know that it can have an effect when it comes to how citizens look at journalism and media in general. It can reduce the trust of journalism.
So they say don't use the term because it's bad for the country as a whole, essentially.
Yeah, basically. So I'm quoting one of the ministers who said that we should be careful about the way we're using this term, because we've seen how Trump has been using it and how this is kind of like an attack on independent media.
Do you notice a trend? We're just talking politicians broadly. Is it a certain type of politician that tends to use the term more? Like, is it the more right-wing, or in Norway you have is it the Progress Party? The Progress Party. Yeah. Is it this more sort of populist, classic understanding? One of the kind of original quote-unquote populist parties. Do they tend to use it more? Is it sort of that same kind of nationalist politicians that are using it, or is it kind of across the political spectrum?
Yeah, it was actually across the political spectrum, and I have to say my study of the politicians is more like a shorter case study, so I haven't been able to look at this over many years across many politicians, but it was kind of interesting because it was used much more in local newspapers. Politicians in local newspaper was using it more than in the national media, so it might be a concern on the national level that we should be a bit careful about this term, while on the local level it's become more like a saying for something you dislike.
Could that also be because local politicians maybe don't have the same filters, or maybe they're not as trained as well? Like, there's sort of a different dynamic with local politicians, right? A lot of times you don't have to be a career politician to be a local politician. So maybe do you think they're adopting these trends or not thinking about the democratic implications, perhaps?
It could be, but in general, the term has been fairly popular, and we've seen a high increase in the use of the term when we look at the media archive. So I think it has become a term that lots of people are using, not only politicians, but also people in general, to say that something is fake. But when we tag along news, it makes an impact on how we look at news.
Right. And on that point, I want to talk a little bit about your work in the media in Norway and building up the online presence there. But I wanted to ask about, you cover in the book fact-checking and what can be done to sort of combat fake news. So from your research, what have you found in terms of the effectiveness of fact-checking, and maybe what are some of the ways that we can fight fake news?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part of the research, because we don't have all the answers. And I think we need a lot more research into that area, because we know that how corrections are made, how they're presented, how they're framed, how they're illustrated are very important. Some researchers are talking about making a truth sandwich. George Lakoff is talking about that. You shouldn't repeat the lie immediately. You should explain the correction, and then you can say something about the context, and then come back to the correction again. Because if you're constantly repeating the lie while doing the fact checks, people are going to remember the lie.
Right.
And also, there are some findings that say that people are remembering images or videos better when it comes to corrections. But in general, I think we need much more research, because if people are not trusting the fact checkers, it doesn't matter. So we need to figure out what works when it comes to correct manipulated information, and when it comes to fact resistance among citizens. Why are some people resisting listening to facts and established knowledge?
Right. Even when they're presented with the corrected information, they believe the lie anyways.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about your work in the journalism sector, where you worked with one of Norway's largest tabloids, Dagbladet, and you helped launch their blog. And I'm curious to hear about this community platform called Blink, which is interesting. As I understand it from reading your profile, it was kind of getting one of Norway's largest media into the online space in the time when that was maybe not so established. So what were you doing there, and what was this Blink community?
Yeah. So to start a little bit before that, in 2002, I was finished my master thesis at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and I was doing research on interactivity, and we were doing courses on online communities. So that was a huge thing back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that was also something that was appearing in Norway in the early 2000s, online communities. You probably remember Second Life. That was a big one. MySpace.
Yeah. MySpace was my intro into the social media world. For better, for worse.
Friendster, Classmates. And we had several of those smaller online communities in Norway. And when I started working at Dagbladet, they had already created this online community called Blink. So it was very much text-based community where you had profiles and people could look at your profile and you can see who had looked at your profile and you can write to each other. So
was it within the context of the news?
No, so it's kind of like a separate place, but it was linked through the news site. So from the news site, you could go to the online community, Blink. And back in those days, and that was 2004, almost every kid in Norway had a profile on this community.
Kids, not your typical
Younger.
Newspaper reading audience.
Yeah, so youth, they had profiles and they connected to each other and they wrote to each other, and of course there were lots of issues and problems and concerns related to that. So we had several online communities in Norway before Facebook, but they more or less disappeared when Facebook arrived.
Because one of those that you worked with afterwards was called Origo. And I'm curious to hear about that. It's interesting to hear about all these kind of failed cases of social media to get a sense of why these 4 or 5 now are so popular. So what was Origo? Was that similar to Blink, or?
In a way, because it was also connected to newspapers. So Blink was connected to Dagbladet, which is one of the largest tabloids in Norway, and Origo was partly owned by a group called A-pressen, which today is called A-media, which owns lots of local newspapers in Norway, 70 or something like that. So all these local newspapers, they had opportunity to use Origo as part of an online community to the local newspaper. So if you had 2,000 readers of the newspaper, they could have a profile, they could share pictures, they could put events into the calendar, they could post kind of blog posts. We didn't call it blog posts, but basically that was what it was. They could contribute as citizen journalists to the local newspaper. So it was a digital space for local communities, very much closely connected to the newspaper, but you didn't have to integrate that much. You decided yourself as a user.
And who is building these platforms? I mean, was there a software development team and all these coders? Were they was it just in Norway that they were kind of coding the platform itself?
Yeah, so I was working for the tech company who developed the platform, and that was called Bengler. So this was a group of programmers who are still working and developing lots of cool stuff, digital stuff. And so this was basically focused on Norway. We had some conversations with media companies in Germany, in Sweden, but this was very much a Norwegian project. But I think in some of the communities where it worked really well, there was this interesting effect in the sense of people posting pictures, contributing content, text, creating events, like physical events, based on the online community. But of course, to be able to develop as good technology as some of the big American Silicon Valley companies, it requires a lot of resources. Yeah. And this was a small company. So it was very hard to compete.
I can imagine. Yeah. I can imagine. So we were talking earlier about Norwegian politics being very kind of rooted in the local level, having a strong local presence. So as you're saying that Origo had some communities at the local level that were very active in using the site. Did you see any politicians sort of getting in there, getting involved and trying to campaign?
Absolutely. Yeah, lots of politicians had their local profiles, and parties also had presence there. So the idea was to connect with the local community through this site. I mean, I started working there 2009, but this was created in 2006, and Facebook became popular in Norway 2007. But still, in 2007, 2008, Origo was a fairly important place for politicians, or it was a useful place for them to have a profile. But eventually, everyone they moved over to Facebook, and they started a profile and eventually a page. Yeah.
So now that Origo is gone, and I'm curious. So it's not that Facebook came around and politicians just jumped on it. They had some experience in online organizing before. So why do you think that they went over to Facebook? Do you think it's because they saw Obama use it, or do you think that perhaps the platform was just easier to use?
Lots of reasons. Of course, Facebook became massively popular, so everyone started using that. So it was important to be at a place where everyone else were active. So that was one reason. The migration, that was very clear. And then, of course, functionality, the kind of tools, the interface, on Facebook, that was very tempting and affordable for the politicians. And it was possible to connect Facebook with other apps. So it was part of a larger ecosystem. And it's also the whole bandwagon effect. You want to jump on the latest shiny thing. So for a while, politicians in Norway, they had profiles everywhere, but now we see that they have a much more focused social media presence.
And I want to talk a bit about this migration to Facebook, because you've done some work, as you were saying, on the 2013 election, where you did a really interesting study that was really novel at the time, because you mixed some interviews with the trace data from the platform. And you had a really interesting take on it, which is politicians are saying certain things about how they're using social media, but let's check actually how they are using it. Can you tell us a bit about that study and what you were kind of trying to do there? Because I guess this was the first Norwegian election after Obama had sort of popularized social media.
Yeah, I mean, we saw politicians who went on Facebook in like 2008, 2009. So we had the election in 2013 and then in 2009, but in 2009 that was not very big. But the whole saying at the time, also internationally, was that these technologies are very social. You have to create dialogue. That's the whole purpose of that. If you're not into dialogue, what's the point of using Twitter or Facebook or YouTube even? You were supposed to be active in the comment section and create this community with your users. So I wanted to look into the reality of this kind of saying, because that was something that appeared in the interviews, that they wanted to have dialogue with
the actual citizens.
With the citizens, with their supporters, but also opponents. And in order to check that, I wanted to look at the comment section, and I wanted to see how often are they in dialogue or answering people in the comment section. And since there's so many comments, we had to figure out a way to automate how we can track the appearance of the page owner. So with some help from programmers at the University of Oslo, we created a database where it was possible to look at how often the page owner is appearing in the comment section. And then I looked at the political parties and checked what kind of dialogue tendency do we see here. And particularly when it came to the Labour Party, and at the time the Norwegian Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, he was answering once during the election campaign. And then another finding was that the Progress Party, the populist right-wing party, they were fairly active in the comment section, answering people. So it seemed like they were following up on the strategy they had when it comes to being in dialogue, or at least answering people in the comment section in a different way compared to the Labour Party back then.
Yeah, because it's you outline these three through the interviews, which were done before the election, to kind of figure out what their strategies were going into it. You found these three positive aspects that they talked about. One was this dialogue with citizens. The other one was getting feedback from them to see how their policies are doing, and then bypassing the media, which we talked about before. But then there were these negative aspects that they also mentioned, and that was offensive behavior from citizens, getting negative media attention, and then just not having the resources to do it. So I'm wondering if you could talk about particularly the negative aspects. How are Norwegian politicians thinking that, we've been talking about how, okay, we can create this dialogue with citizens. That doesn't happen in all the cases. But what about these negative aspects? How is social media perceived as something that could hurt their efforts campaigning?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I think it's still a huge problem. And when it comes to hate speech, that's become a much larger problem since that study.
In Norway?
In Norway, yeah. Also in the politicians' comment sections, because they get so many comments, and it requires so much resources from the party or the politicians to be able to moderate and delete and respond to comments. So it's a fairly hard job to be able to have some kind of civilized comment section. So when it comes to hate speech, that's become a big topic in the sense that it's happening on politicians' Facebook pages, but also on social media in general, and on Twitter and in different groups. And we've also seen politicians who are retiring from office because they don't want to continue because of the level of hate speech. Yes.
Do you think that tends to affect women more? You hear a lot about that in terms of harassment.
We know that there's a difference in the type of harassment female and male politicians get. Often it's more personal harassment, more sexual threats against women or female politicians. But we've also seen examples of male politicians pulling out of politics because of the online behavior.
Interesting. So you mentioned, and I think it's as we're recording, in 2 or 3 weeks, there's local elections in Norway, and particularly because I think Norway is so interesting in having this strong local component to their politics and the newspapers and things like that. What are you seeing in terms of politicians' social media use there? I mean, there's an uptick in campaigning, I'm sure, but is there anything interesting that's going on at the local level in terms of social media or digital?
Yeah, of course, I think the whole use of social media has become much more professionalized. They have clear strategies. More politicians are using Facebook pages compared to back in 2013. We also have seen some politicians who have removed their pages and only using their private profile. So there's some interesting tendencies. And we also see that quite a few politicians are using Instagram, Twitter not so much. But another thing that is much more popular these days is that people are discussing in groups. You have more thematic groups concerning important issue in the election campaign, and lots of the conversation is going on within those groups. And then we also know that advertisement has moved from lots of the online sites and of course printed newspapers to the online communities or to Facebook and Google. So there's also a transfer of money from Norwegian media to Mark Zuckerberg. So in general, social media is important, but it's complicated. And I did a speak last week about micro-targeting in Norway, because now we are able to see the advertisements, the sponsored posts that different parties have published. But I must say that the tool Facebook has released so far is not very impressive.
Library.
The ad library is not very helpful.
No, it's not.
No. But you know that is something all the parties are doing. They're paying money to get more visibility on Facebook.
It's interesting what you say about the local politicians moving away from pages and using their personal profile. Because actually, I think with Facebook putting in this, where they're de-ranking the content from pages and promoting that from friends, it's probably a smart move. But then they're limited to, say, 5,000 friends, and then they can't micro-target. So I wonder how that will play out for these. I mean, you have to have a pretty small constituency to be friends with 5,000 people and your family.
No, but the general tendency is that compared to 2013, many more politicians have pages now compared to back then. But I was looking at the numbers in 2018, and then I saw that among 169 politicians, 6 or 7 had removed their pages. And I was like, why is that? But I guess if you're a local politician and you have a strong network on your personal profile, it's more effective than having a kind of empty page.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't heard that before. That's great. Well, I know you have some things to do, meetings, and we have a conference soon. So, Dr. Kalsnes, thanks so much for taking the time out and coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Bente Kalsnes, Associate Professor in Communication at Christiania University College. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I've been hustling for interviews recently and have an excellent cast of digital strategists and top-tier academics coming on the show in the next 2 to 3 months. So stay tuned, subscribe if you haven't already, follow us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.